Good morning. Our first speaker is Governor Scott Walker. Governor Scott Walker was elected president of Young America's Foundation on February 1st, 2021. Governor Walker was raised with a heart for public service, patriotism, and hard work. He moved to the small town of Delavan, Wisconsin, where he was when he was in third grade. There, his father was a minister and his mother worked part-time as a bookkeeper and secretary. Scott was active in school, sports, church, Scouts, and American Legion's Badger Boys State and Boys Nation programs. In June 1993, Scott was elected to the State Assembly, where he helped lead the way on welfare reform, public safety, and educational opportunities. In 2002, he was elected to the Milwaukee County Executive Office. In this position, Scott worked to reform the scandal-ridden county government and faithfully kept his promise to spend taxpayer money as if it were his own. In 2008, he won re-election with nearly 60% of the vote. On November 2nd, 2010, Scott was elected the 45th governor of Wisconsin. Inheriting a $3.6 billion budget deficit, $800 million worth of unpaid bills, and an 8% unemployment rate, he immediately implemented reforms to renew economic revival, fiscal order, and government accountability in Wisconsin. Scott is one of the only governors in American history to survive a recall election on June 5th, 2012. He was re-elected in 2014 and sworn into a second term on January 5th, 2015. He serves on the boards of Students for Life Action, American Federation for Children, and Center for State-Led National Debt Solutions. Please join me in welcoming Governor Scott Walker.
Well, good morning. We'll try that again. Good morning.
Good morning.
There. Now we're you're all engaged here. Great to see you here. Glad you had a great day. Actually, it's a great day to be inside today, at least in the morning, because of the fog. It was a great day to be at the ranch yesterday. So this morning, we're going to start out with a simple concept. Socialism sucks. Actually, you could apply it to any variation of it. Socialism, communism, Marxism, they're all intertwined in many ways, even though there's slight distinctions amongst them all. But at its core is about Marxism. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about it from a couple different angles that tie into your visit at the ranch, being here at the Reagan Ranch Center, and what we're talking about through the remainder of this conference. But the idea that Marxism, for example, sucks is something that probably self-apparent to many of you here and maybe even some of your friends, fellow students, and others, but it's not as obvious across the country. In fact, on the way in, I was just talking to Kyle Furby, who you're going to hear from tomorrow, who leads, there he is, way in the back, I look at the lights. So Kyle's going to talk to you tomorrow. He's our director out in Dixon, in the middle, in the heartland of America. He runs the Ronald Reagan Boyhood Home, where we have conferences for high school, college, and eventually for middle school, just like we do here as well at the Reagan Ranch. And it was interesting, Kyle conveyed to me, and Kyle, I apologize if I'm paraphrasing this wrong, but you know, at Dixon, because like the center here is in Santa Barbara, and unlike the ranch that you physically went up to with all the winding roads, in Dixon, the home is pretty easy to get to. It's in the middle of town. It's right off. There's actually an interstate, a tollway named after President Reagan. It's right accessible. And so in addition to the conferences that Young America's Foundation has there, we have a lot of visitors. We have people that come in off the street. And frequently, before we took it over, even more so now, we'll have school groups come in. And one of the things he told me not too long ago, earlier this year, that kind of shook me, was there were some fifth graders in, and he was explaining some things and talked about how President Reagan helped defeat communism. And Kyle, if I'm wrong, correct me if I'm wrong in this, but one of the shocking things you conveyed to me and the rest of our team was that some of these kids that not much younger than you are, actually one of them said, well, was like, why is that a bad thing? And Kyle pried a little bit and he said, well, this young student thought that communism was actually just a way of helping other people. And sadly, and you may have even heard this on your way to where you're at in high school right now, and you're certainly going to hear it in college. I often said over the last 2 years during COVID, closing our colleges down would probably do more to stop the spread of communism than it would to stop the spread of COVID, because of what many of our professors and teaching assistants and others are teaching there, but you may have even experienced in your own schools, not only in high school, but maybe at younger ages. And so we're going to dispel some of those poor intentions that are passed on, not only in school, but throughout society today. And I'm going to use 3 examples of things that are connected to the Reagan Ranch and the Reagan Ranch Center. First off is a book that's up on the bookshelf. When you came in the ranch house yesterday, there's a replica right literally above where I'm standing here in the Reagan Ranch Center of the shelves that President Reagan built along with one of his aides. He's got all sorts of great books. I love the connection actually to where Kyle works in Dixon. I call it the bookends because there's books up there that he read later in life, but there's a couple up there in the ranch and in the replica up above us that are books he learned and read when he was a young man in Dixon, Illinois. One of those books is called That Printer of Udell. Now, the obvious story that people hear about that, and an important one for sure, certainly for me personally as a believer, was he and his brother read that book, and they both decided after reading it that they wanted to go and be baptized at the church down the way. And that's an important story in and of itself. But for my point about Marxism, communism, socialism, variations of such, is one of the other important things about that book was that he also learned, one of the plots, if you will, one of the themes in that book is that charity is the responsibility of the individual and of the church or of the place of worship, not of the government. Not of the government. I often think about that when you talk about socialism, communism, Marxism. Back for years, Bernie Sanders ran in 2016 and again 2 years ago in 2020. He promised all sorts of free stuff. He's a self-proclaimed socialist. In fact, I have great respect for Bernie Sanders because at least he's honest about the fact he's a socialist. There's a lot of other people who are socialist/communist out there. They just pretend to be something less threatening. But he's kind of moved the parameters out there. I remember when he spoke at the DNC convention in 2020, he said things that were considered to be radical just a few years ago are now mainstream. You know, they may be mainstream amongst his supporters, but they're historically not been mainstream in this country. But he talks about all these free things. And he talks about it from the standpoint of taking care of others. And oftentimes throughout his campaigns, he's pointed to the Scandinavian countries. And he'll say, well, you know, you look at them, they're socialist countries and they do just fine. And repeatedly, both in 16 and again when he said that throughout the 2020 campaign, people like the Prime Minister, the Danish Prime Minister would say, no, wait a minute, time out here. We are not a socialist economy. That Prime Minister and others point out in that country and others throughout Scandinavian parts of Europe will say they are a market-based economy that just happens to have very generous social benefits. Now, we're going to talk in a minute about why market-based capitalism is better than government-driven socialism or variations that flow into communism and Marxism. But just on the principle of taking care of others, the Danish and Scandinavian countries are not socialist economies, they're market-based economies. But they have very generous benefits. Even that, I would argue, is something to challenge along the way. Not taking care of people, but who's responsible for that? When I was governor years ago, we did massive what we called welfare reform. And one of the things I love to stress is, to me, public assistance, I feel that as strongly today, public assistance should be more like a trampoline and less like a hammock. Let me repeat that again. You don't remember anything else today? That's a good phrase to remember. Public assistance should be more like a trampoline and less like a hammock. Why do I say that? Because, yeah, there are going to be people who are down and out, who need our help, who need our assistance. We saw it during COVID, for example, when the government shut businesses down, when they stopped people from being able to work. It made sense that we provided assistance. But sadly, what we've seen in the time since is most people have been back to work, and we still saw over the last 2 years all sorts of benefits given from the government, all sorts of so-called stimulus checks along the way. And what has that done? Well, you go to most employers across the country, and they'll tell you they don't have enough workers. I can't tell you how many times I've been frustrated walking into a restaurant, and they'll say, oh, it's a half an hour wait, and I look, and there's half of the restaurant is open, and people aren't seated there. Well, it's because they don't have enough workers there. You see it not only in the hospitality industry, but you see it elsewhere out there. Well, it's because we've trained people not to work. During COVID, when they provided unemployment assistance, in some cases was double what people were making. When they provided stimulus checks, and think about that, just from a, thankfully you weren't necessarily in the mix of that, but maybe your parents or older siblings and that. It made sense to me that when things were shut down, the government would make a little assistance for folks. But why would you be paying people more? Or why, when people were getting the same or more from unemployment, or their employer was getting a paycheck protection plan loan so that they could keep getting a paycheck, they could keep getting paid, why did we need stimulus checks on top of that? I think many in Washington and even at the state and local level wanted more people to become dependent on the government. That's not real charity. Taking your money and giving it to other people without your say, that's not charity out there. That's one of the things Reagan learned from that book that stuck with him throughout the rest of your life. He was a very charitable man. But he understood that the charity doesn't come from the government. And it certainly is with a connection of dignity. I'll give you two quick examples. So when you went up to the ranch house yesterday, when you were on the tour, when you go around that area that used to be a screened-in porch, past that bumper pool table, there's a window that looks into where there was a bar and the kitchen in there, and on the panels there that kind of open up of those doors, there's some beautiful leatherwork. There's some cowboys on it, some horses on it. That was done by a family called the Siscos. Years ago when he was governor, the Siscos reached out to then Governor Ronald Reagan and asked for some help because they had a brother, a sibling, who was what we would say today had an intellectual disability, and they weren't getting the help that they needed from the state government. So in addition to pointing them in the right direction, personally, Ronald Reagan, then governor, had a great amount of sympathy or empathy for that family. He understood through their contacts, through their communications, that they were really good at leatherwork. And so he asked them to do leatherwork. In fact, those two panels in particular, he asked them to do in 1980 when he was running for president of the United States. And one of the cool framed letters that you might have seen on the table there was a letter he sent to them after he was elected president. So he's president-elect. I know what it's like in a transition. It's like drinking out of a fire hose. It's that intense along the way, but he still sent them a thank you for the work that they had done. Well, he had empathy, something he learned from his mother in Dixon, Illinois. He had empathy for that family. He was a charitable person. He wanted to help them, but he also understood the essence, the concept of dignity, that you don't just give things away to people. You ask for something in return. You honor the dignity of work. I've often said that true freedom and prosperity don't come from the clumsy hand of the government. They come from empowering people to live their own lives and control their own destinies through the dignity of work. You were in high school, and I think they still do this. My kids did, and they're a few years older than you, but do you guys still have yearbooks at most high schools? So a long, long time ago in the 80s, when President Reagan was in office, I was in high school as well. And I got to tell you, looking back at our yearbooks over the years at reunions, I don't ever remember anyone who said, Scott, good luck becoming dependent in the government, right? Because that's not our goal in life. That's not in our spirit. That's not what our instincts are. We have big dreams. Hopefully you have big dreams. And part of your goal is to figure out, match your dreams with your talents so that, you know, I can dream to be an astronaut, but I don't have the talents to be an astronaut, so you try and match the two together. But your dreams aren't to become dependent in the government. But sadly, a lot of folks, particularly in Washington, want that. And that's part of the failure, the failed concept of Marxism, communism, socialism. We had some visitors here, I remember about a year ago, we took up to the ranch. They were from the old Soviet republics, the old Soviet Union. They'd come before the Soviet Union broke up. The part they were from, ironically, is what we call today Ukraine. And I remember his name in particular because his name was Mikhail. So we joked he was the second Mikhail that had come to the Reagan Ranch. Of course, the first, you see the images up above by the Jeep in the exhibit hall, was Mikhail Gorbachev, the general secretary in the Soviet Union back many decades ago. But this couple came and toured, and he said back when they lived in the Soviet Union, the joke was that they pretended to work and the government pretended to pay them. And that kind of was the mindset out there. And it doesn't work, and it certainly doesn't work when it comes to charity. So one of the things is that story in the book, that charity comes from the individual and from the church and the place of worship. That's a responsibility. It's not necessarily that of the government. The government's ultimate right, ultimate responsibility is to protect the rights given to us by God, not the government. That's what comes out of the Declaration of Independence. It's part of what we define in the words of the U.S. Constitution. The second thing I want to tie into when it comes to Marxism, communism, socialism, variations of all the same, is not just something you physically saw, but one of the visitors who came to the Reagan Ranch. When you come in the center here, you see there's a special exhibit that was brought out earlier this year because of the Jubilee and then the passing of Queen Elizabeth. About just shy of 40 years ago, she came up to the Reagan Ranch on a rainy day, wanted to ride with then President Ronald Reagan, wasn't able to because of the rain, but made a wonderful visit up there. In fact, even though they couldn't ride, they had lunch together that day. And what was kind of funny is the President and First Lady had a special lunch plan. They served them Southwest menu, and on the way down, one of the President's aides asked the Queen if she enjoyed her time at the ranch. She did, and she said she particularly liked lunch. She was really quite fond of the reused beans. Any of you had Southwest menus before know they're refried beans. I can only imagine reused beans. It's like, here, have my reused beans. Wouldn't be very attractive out there. But she was one of only a handful of foreign leaders. In fact, very few people visited the ranch. You're blessed to be able to have gone up there because very few people physically got up there. Family and friends, even that was fairly limited. And throughout all the time they had the ranch, there really were only four major world leaders who were there. The Queen, the Prime Minister of Canada, was good friends with the President. Gorbachev, we'll talk about in a second. And then Margaret Thatcher. Margaret Thatcher, of course, is the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom. And at one point, she said something that fits right into what we're talking about this morning. She said, the problem with socialism is sooner or later you run out of other people's money, right? Another thing, if you don't remember anything else in this part, remember that. The problem with socialism, and you could put any number of isms in there, is that sooner or later you run out of other people's money. Now, that was particularly true with what we saw, not just with socialism, but with communism in the old Soviet Union. Gorbachev, of course, passed away early this year before the Queen did, and there was a lot of talk. In fact, it ties in not only today, but if you look, there's some flyers up in the front near where the Berlin Wall is at, and they talk about the wall coming down. Back then, even as it was, as people talked about Gorbachev's obituary, they give him credit for the fall of communism, for the fall of the Berlin Wall. And certainly he deserves some credit, but he was not the one that made that happen. If anyone, certainly top of the list, it's Ronald Reagan. I would throw in Margaret Thatcher and Pope John Paul II at the time. Gorbachev reluctantly, he was more an observer who could accurately see what was happening out there. But it goes back to that phrase that Thatcher said about socialism. In this case, you could insert communism or Marxism as well. The problem with it is sooner or later you run out of other people's money to spend. In the case of the old Soviet Union, what finally got Gorbachev's attention, and he, by the way, back then got the Nobel Peace Prize for the fall of communism, which he was more an observer. He was more of, it's like, the police showing up and saying, put the goods down. We've got you. Okay, I'll do that. No problem. He's not the one to award. It's the person who caught the person in the act along the way. But Reagan always used to say, it's amazing what you get done if you don't care who gets credit for it. And this is clearly one of those where his goal was to bring the fall of communism, to bring freedom, not to just protect it here, but to bring freedom to peoples all across this world. But when I think of Gorbachev, particularly at Reykjavik, there's a great book called Reagan at Reykjavik by Edelman, who was part of the national security team during that summit. And a lot of the media at the time thought it was a failure because they didn't come out with some big announcement. But ultimately, it was one of those critical moments because Reagan was so adamant about pushing the Strategic Defense Initiative, SDI. The media at the time and some of his critics called it Star Wars. People thought it was this missile defense system that they thought, the critics thought could never happen. I don't know if any of you remember last year when there were those images at night over Israel of the missiles being shot. You could see them, they were really intense images. The pictures of the missiles being shot by the terrorists going to try and attack certain key spots in the state of Israel. And what happened, you could see these images of the missiles were going up and they were exploding in the air. That's called the Iron Dome. Where did that technology came from? It was a strategic defense initiative. It was Reagan's goal. And he was so adamant in that he didn't not only just want that for America, he was willing to offer it to Gorbachev and the Soviet Union. His goal was peace, peace through strength. If you have strength, if you're able to protect against the aggressors in these communist, Marxist, socialist countries, you can, in return, protect not only your own country, you can protect people around the world. Well, the media didn't buy into it, his critics didn't buy into it, but thankfully at that Reykjavik summit, the one person he needed to buy into it, maybe the only person at that summit, was Mikhail Gorbachev. And eventually, even because Reagan was willing to walk away, Gorbachev had to concede the old Soviet Union didn't have not only the military capacity, they didn't have the economic ability. They were a crumbling economy because communist, socialist, Marxist regimes ultimately never really work. And so they didn't have the money to keep up. In fact, we've now seen in the last year or two plenty of documented pieces of evidence that even during that era, a lot of times the parades that they would have through Moscow and the Red Square were oftentimes showing off military equipment that was really just hollowed out, almost Hollywood-like images of weapons, weren't even the real deal in some cases. It's because they were trying to keep up with the United States, but they didn't have the economic power to do that. Because eventually the problem with socialism, communism, Marxism is you run out of other people's money to spend. We saw it not only in the old Soviet Union. You're going to hear more about it later from part of our program team here is going to talk about Cuba. Before COVID a few years ago, you know what the minimum wage was in Cuba? Anybody have an idea? What do you think the minimum wage was back? Sure. $2? Actually, it was higher than that. What do you think? $3? It was $17. Yeah. But not per hour. Not per day. Not per week. The minimum wage up until a couple years ago in Cuba was $17 a month. A month. Now it's gone up a little bit, but not significant compared to what we all make on a typical day here in the United States. But think about that. Even with these promises of free health care, free housing, free transportation, I would imagine all of you, and probably your parents do this, but if you look at what your cell phone bill is, just the phones you have in front of you today would cost more than $17 a month. Heck, just the storage on your phones in some cases costs more than $17 a month. And for all the talk about, we've got all these other free things. Remember the protest out in front of the Cuban Communist Party headquarters last year? Why was that? Now, I'm not taking a position on whether vaccines are good or bad, but at a minimum, you should at least have the choice whether you want to have a vaccine against COVID. And in Cuba, their protests were because their healthcare professionals, by and large, are trained and then sent to other countries, and they didn't actually have access to even having vaccines if they wanted them there. So in this place that promises, wonderful socialized medicine that has public housing and public transportation, which if you go to Cuba, well, you'll probably hear this validated in a little bit later today, which is at best not very good, was offering minimum wages of something like $17 per month. That's what happens, when you run out of other people's money to spend. You see it in Venezuela, another country. We had last month a great speaker, one of the young people that came was someone who came from Venezuela. Venezuela, blessed by natural resources, blessed with these abundant natural resources in the last 2 decades, back 15, 20 years ago, was one of the wealthiest countries in this hemisphere. The last few years, because of socialism and Marxist tendencies, 8 out of 9 people live in poverty. In fact, they don't only live in poverty, you can physically see it. The average Venezuelan most years, the last few years, has lost somewhere between 20 and 25 pounds because of malnutrition and deprivation. So you can physically see the impact of socialism, Marxism, communist impact as well. So you can see the economic impact. It's what brought about the fall of the Soviet Union. It's what we see failing in places like Cuba and Venezuela and others across the world. But finally, in addition to thinking about that book and the idea that it's the role of us as individuals in the places we worship to take care of people more than it is of the government. That's what we learned in that book that's on the bookshelf that he read at the Boy at Home in Dixon. In addition to thinking about one of the visitors that came here to the ranch and the idea that she said, the problem with socialism applies to Marxism and communism is that sooner or later you run out of other people's money. The last image I want you to think of is we came in the door. And maybe you came in a hurry, maybe you were late, you didn't think about it, but before you leave today or tomorrow, spend a few moments looking at that slab of the Berlin Wall. Because what that represents is that Marxism, socialism, communism, all sooner or later lead to the same thing. They make promises of power to the people. Power to the people. And in the end, the people end up in poverty, and the elites have the power. That slab is a great reminder of the oppression that comes from Marxism, from socialism, from communism. It has throughout the history of the world, and it continues even today. We not only saw it in the old Soviet republics, not just the Soviet Unions, but those Soviet republics as well. It's why it's interesting. If you look at the slab on the side you see, what side of the Berlin Wall do you think that is that we look at when we come in? Anybody have an idea? What's that? Yeah, the side you see with all the spray painting on is the side that would face the free part of Germany, the free and open part. The side that's clear, that's on the other side facing the wall, was the part that nobody could get to because you'd be dead if you ran into that part out there. They had guards along the way. They had people. It's always interesting to me for all the haters out there. You might see some in your schools in high school. You certainly see it if you go on to college. For all the people who hate America, we didn't have to put a fence up to keep people out. If anything, we're not trying to keep people from coming into America. We're just trying to make sure they come in legally with the debate about a wall on our southern border. But we don't have to put up a wall to keep people from leaving the United States. I remember when I was at Cuba years ago as governor, I went to go visit some of the soldiers that we had from the military police unit that were guarding some of the detainees there. And in addition there, I went out with one of the Marines who went to the University of Wisconsin. He was showing me the perimeter out there. And there's about 17 miles of fence. Guantanamo Bay is a naval base, but it's got all 5 branches. You land at the Air Force Base. The Coast Guard brings you across the bay. The Navy runs things and does the guard on the seaside. The Army does oversees the detainees, and the Marines are up on the perimeter on the wall. And I remember it was interesting, they observed it, so it's 17 miles and there's this little water gate in the middle that flows into Guantanamo Bay. And 2 things came to mind. One was the Marine told me that the Marines are looking out at Cuba, and there's minefields and other things, and they said their counterparts from Cuba aren't looking at them, they're looking at Cuba. Why do you think? Why would that be? Why wouldn't they be looking at us? Because they don't want people to leave. They're guarding against people trying to flee into this naval base of the United States out there. And in fact, they're so adamant about, the Marine told me that years and years ago, Fidel Castro put a meat processing plant just past the gates along the water's edge as the water flows out into the bay, and they pushed their scraps in there. And it was almost diabolical, almost sounded like something out of a James Bond movie, but it was true. He said the reason they put the scraps out there is they wanted sharks to come into the bay so that people in Cuba couldn't swim out to try and be free. We don't do that in America. If you want to get up and leave today, if you want to go somewhere else in the world, you can do it. Why would they do it? It's the same reason they put up barriers in the Soviet Union. It's the same reason why you couldn't cross the Berlin Wall. Because in the end, people who live under Marxism, communism, socialism, in the end, the power doesn't flow to the people, it flows to the elite. And the people live not only in poverty, but they live under oppression. We see even in places that have flashes of so-called economic success. You see it today in communist China. Talk about the Uyghurs. I can't believe people on the left who talk about, this need for looking out for social justice. Where are they when it comes to people who are encamped because of their religious beliefs? How is that possible? We certainly don't have that in a free society. Is everything perfect in America? No. But those aren't because of the form of government we have. Ultimately, that's the choice we have. It's between a free society or a place that makes promises, but in the end doesn't live up to them. That's what you get with communism, socialism, Marxism. We had about a month ago at this podium at dinner for one of our sessions, Yeonmi Park, who is a woman who a few years back left North Korea. She fled North Korea with her mother. She went into China. It's a horrific story of the abuse that she went through, ultimately made her way to Mongolia, which is between China and Siberian part of Russia, was then helped on her way through South Korea, and eventually ended up in the United States. She actually went to Columbia University, and what got attention, she shared this in her story, was that she went to this campus and all these people talked about how awful America was and how we were awful because of inequality. And she said, let me tell you about my country, the country she came from, North Korea. She said, generations ago, there was all sorts of inequality in in North Korea. And the leaders there at the time said, well, give us your freedoms, give us your property, give us your rights, and we'll in turn take care and make everything even. And she said, if you go there today, you'll realize that people don't have any rights, they don't have any freedoms, they don't have any property, and there's still inequality. The reality is, those countries make promises, those leaders make promises that they can't live up to. And that's what that image of the Berlin Wall is about. It's not just a distant remnant some 4 decades ago. That's happening today in China. It's happening in Hong Kong. It's happening in Cuba. It's happening in Venezuela. It's not just about failed economic policies. It's ultimately about living under oppressive regimes. And as much as we've had our challenges here, the beauty is, I even said this last June, a little bit of a provocative statement, but I pointed out that you don't have something like Juneteenth Day if you don't have the 4th of July. The freedoms that are celebrated on Juneteenth Day, which is a reflection of the last known slave in a Confederate state being told in Galveston, Texas, on the 19th of June, 1865, about the Emancipation Proclamation that President Lincoln initiated during the Civil War. That, to me, doesn't happen unless you have the 4th of July. Even though we hadn't always lived up to those principles during the earliest parts of the history of this great nation, it's that idea that on July 4th, we declared that all people, regardless of race or sex or gender, all people are equal. And that we are given rights not by the government, but by our God, by our Creator. Not the least of which are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And it is the role of the government to protect those rights. That's what makes America different. That's what makes us unlike Marxist and socialist and communist regimes out there. And that's why, as you continue in high school, when you go on to college or technical school or community college or into the workforce, whatever it might be, the counter you need to give to those out there want to make it into something different. Because let's be clear, all this talk about sex and race and gender overwhelmingly is not because of those issues. It's a much larger argument out there. In the end, you look at the 3 organizers of Black Lives Matter, the organization, they're all self-proclaimed Marxist organizers. See, Marxism didn't work. In many ways, it ties into President Reagan. A guy who lived in 5 different homes, none of which his family owned themselves, who was the son of an alcoholic, a dad who was in and out of work all the time, a son whose mother had to work a series of odd jobs just to keep them afloat, who worked 12-hour days from 14 on all the way through college, who went to a community college, who worked a couple odd jobs at radio stations in Iowa, who made his way to Hollywood, but not as the top star, as a B-movie star, which today would kind of like being the opening act for a concert. You're not the star, but you're doing okay. Who did all those things, who wasn't born into a high-class society, but became not only the president of the United States, but arguably the most important leader in the world in the 20th century. If someone like that can be in a position like that, America's not a class-based society. That's why Marxism never worked in the past. It didn't even get a foothold here. But Marxists, like the leaders of Black Lives Matter, the organization, are trying to come back not based on income, but based on sex and race and gender. And anytime you disagree with them, you're racist, you're sexist, you're transphobic. You hear those words all the time. Whether it's from your teachers, or whether it's from your fellow classmates, probably most certainly you see it on social media. Don't let them bring you down. Our counter to them should be simple. We love America. We love this country so much. We don't care whether you're young or old. We don't care whether you're rich or poor. We don't care whether you're black or white or what you look like or what your ethnicity is. We don't care whether you came here or you were born here or you came here legally from somewhere else. We want you and future generations to have the same rights and the same freedoms that we were inherited from past generations, from our parents and grandparents and those before us. Those are things we can fight for, not just as conservatives, but as Americans. To me, that's probably the most important thing I took away from Ronald Reagan was that those freedoms and those opportunities were worth fighting for, not just for ourselves and our own families, but for everyone. That's how we counter Marxism. That's how we counter socialism. That's how we ultimately counter socialism. All those isms are about false promises. We've got a true promise, but we got to fight for everyone. Freedom and opportunity for all. With that, I'll take some questions if you got them.
So for Q&A, come and line up here on the screen tape and state your name, school, and a brief question.
Good morning, Mr. Walker.
Good morning.
So you kept talking about how all the isms are bad,
Yeah.
right? Is there anything we can do to help those countries with all those isms? And if so, what can we do?
Yeah. Well, you look at, go back and look at Reagan. Not that everything's about the past, but any number of great world leaders over time have said the best way to make sure you make good decisions is to learn from the past. So whether you're a history major or not, I would suggest the more you can read about history, the better off you are. And in our case, not just because we're here at the Reagan Ranch Center and you were just up at the Reagan Ranch, but President Reagan offers some incredibly good history, some good lessons in history along the way. Think about this. As Margaret Thatcher said, he won the Cold War, arguably more than anyone else. He won the Cold War without ever firing a shot. So it's a healthy balance out here. You know, particularly when we think about things like what Russia is doing with Ukraine today. People would often ask me, and I'm backtracking, I'll get to the heart of your question in a second, but what would Reagan be doing under these circumstances? I said if Reagan was president, Putin wouldn't be in Ukraine in the first place. I am completely convinced that Vladimir Putin saw, unlike with Reagan, peace through strength. Evil needs only weakness to open the door to expanse. And so what he saw was in Afghanistan when Biden almost single-handedly, personally, oversaw such a disastrous withdrawal. I think Vladimir Putin said, here's my shot. And I think not only with Reagan, I think frankly they wouldn't have done it if Trump was president either. Because and people, how can you say that? Everybody makes this false assumption based on a failed theory about his connection to Russia and Putin. The reality is, Putin went into the peninsula, the Crimean Peninsula, during Obama. He did nothing during Trump, and he took action again under Biden. If you're weak, it opens the door to expanse. And so, first off, peace through strength means you don't look for a fight, but you're ready for one. You don't look for a fight, but you're ready for one. I think that's incredibly important when we look at North Korea, we look at Cuba, to a lesser extent, Venezuela, but particularly with China and the Communist Chinese Party, I think we've got to be in a strong position. I think had it not been for the unbelievable resilience and efforts of those just guerrilla fighters in Ukraine pushing back against the Russian army, I believe China would already be in Taiwan. But they took a look at that and said, whoa, we're going to wait and see how this all works out. But I think for us, first thing is don't look for a fight, but be ready for one. The second thing I think for that is, and Reagan, again, was a master at this. In my day when I was your age, because I was in high school and Reagan was president, you know, we didn't have Twitter, we didn't have the internet. But he'd use things like the Voice of America. He supported freedom fighters. He didn't put our men and women in uniform always on the line, but his administration and his supporters and his allies would find ways not only to communicate, to get the message of freedom out there, and to partner with others, but also to support those efforts, those freedom fighters that were out pushing for these efforts around the world. So I think it's really, really important that we do that. The last thing I would add is just to find not only political, but moral leaders to align with on these issues. What he did with John Paul II, who had a vested interest having come from Poland, they were both in very similar circumstances, faced near-death experiences with failed assassination attempts, really aligned them. And I think as leaders in the United States, we need to find not only political, but moral leaders to align with in the pursuit of freedom as well.
Thank you.
Hey, my name is Nathan Thomas. I'm a homeschooler from Blythe, California. And I was wondering, you talked a lot about fighting socialism here in the US. And I realize that that's the top priority. We need to make sure that we fight this ideology here. But how can we help these other countries that are all the way across the world with their fight against socialism?
Two parts. One's a little bit like the last question in terms of helping support those fighting for freedom. And sometimes it's not even just Marxism, socialism, communism. I even think the things we can be doing to be supportive, for example, the people in Iran, who, much like other regimes that we've seen around the world, who I think want to be free. They yearn for freedom. We can't dictate to them. It's part of what we saw in Iraq and Afghanistan and elsewhere. But for those things to hold, they've got to be organic. They've got to be from the ground up. They can't be forced down elsewhere. But we can certainly support at a minimum in word, but also in terms of deeds of supporting others along the way. But I would go back to the first part of your question. I actually think, though, for us, ensuring that we are not a socialist, communist, Marxist nation not only helps our own people, it actually helps inspire others. Because particularly in the world that we live in today, again, unlike when I was your age, I can track what anybody's doing in the world right now. And even most people, even living in far less luxurious, if you want to say, lives, and which, by the way, that goes back to what I think about people hating America. Even people living in welfare today in America live abundantly better lives than the average person anywhere else in most parts of the world. I mean, there's no one in this country, unless they choose to. Now, sadly, you'll see even around here or in California, elsewhere, there are people because of a combination of mental illness, of addiction, and other things, have made choices that unfortunately put them in situations where they're homeless, as an example. But in America, if you want, there's no one who has to live without a home of some sort, with some sort of surrounding. There's no one who lives without food. We're legally required to provide some level of medical assistance. You can't have someone walk in a hospital with an emergency and they can't just be kicked out. That's fairly unique to most parts of the world. And so to the extent that we can not only protect what we have, I would argue go further, be even more free. Most of our problems in this country today, for example, with healthcare, are not because we don't have government healthcare. It's because the healthcare we have even currently or have had for a while here is too driven by the government. If we did more to drive market-based incentives, I think we'd be doing even better. So part of it is not only the things I mentioned of helping others around the world, but I think the better we can be a model, that shining city on the hill that Reagan talked about, the better we can be as a country, not just economically, but in terms of the freedoms we provide and protect for our citizens, the more others are going to want to yearn to do that as well.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hello, my name is Abel Apodaca. I go to Sanger High School here in California. And my question was, with the ongoing threat with Communist China and the great dependence that we have on them and the growing tensions with the whole Taiwan situation, how do you think we should handle that?
There's a great book, first off, if you haven't said it, actually someone who's an alumni of Young America's Foundation, Peter Schweitzer, went to a conference back in the early 1990s, was inspired by that, went on, he wrote a series of great books, the most recent one's called Red-Handed. It's a great book, a lot of the attention in it is about stories about President Joe Biden and his son Hunter and the interaction with communist China and dependency on that, but it also talks about a lot of the corporate world and others along the way. So one, I'd encourage you to read, and there's some copies actually, I think even here, Red-Handed. It's a great book that kind of exposes the problems. But I think a number of things. One, we have to push back. When I was a candidate for president back in 2015, for example, even just little things, it was exposed that the Chinese Communist Party, the Chinese government had hacked into what's called the Office of Management and Business, the OMB, that oversees kind of the administrative part of the federal government. A couple weeks later, President Barack Obama held a state dinner for them. There are just symbolic things like that. I called at the time, got all sorts of grief for it. I said, we should cancel the state dinner. How in the world do you honor the leader of China when you have evidence that they hacked into your own government system out there? So we've got to stop being closed-minded on that. I think over time, it's a series of other things out there we have to push back. But one of the big warnings I would give, for example, they have a 5G network. They have Huawei, which is a company that's a state-owned or state-supported company that does telecommunications through the Chinese Communist Party and the Chinese government. There's a real national security risk for us and other countries around the world if you buy into that. We've been warning our allies around the world not to do that. We've been pushing back on it. But one of the things that came up a few years ago, many of us being on agreement on the security risk, was that we should do a sole source for our 5G to counter that. And my argument back then would be today is we don't beat China by being more like China. We beat China by not being like China, by being like America, by being free. And so we pushed back. We succeeded in saying, no, we should be cautious about making sure we're not aligned with them, but then open up the market to counter along the way. So I think we need to be aggressive in that regard. We need to push back. We need to call them out as much as we call it other places. We can't just say, well, because we're so dependent on them economically, we can't call them out in the same way we would call out Iran or North Korea or others. We have to be even to the point of sanctions, being willing to push back on that and suffer the short-term consequences that go along with that. But what they're doing to the Uyghurs and what they're doing from they're on path to overtake us not only in terms of the economy, but at the pace they're building ships in their naval fleet out there. Part of the reason why we have, throughout my lifetime, been a world power is not just because of the might of our ideas, it's been the ability to back it up. And the ability to have a strong military is dependent on a strong economy that can keep up. That's why, as I mentioned before, the Soviet Union ultimately failed because they couldn't keep up economically. If we don't continue to do things that make our economy strong and then in turn allow us to have a strong military, we're going to cede that power to the Communist Chinese Party. And that's horrible, not just for us and them, but for the rest of the world. I would add one last thing on that, and that is that that means not only from a military or even foreign affairs standpoint, we got to stop doing things like they've been doing in Washington the last few years. All this federal money that's been spilled out, that's the driver, that's the main driver of inflation. If you look at even the budget office, the CBO, the Congressional Budget Office, that projected where inflation would be, all this talk about Biden and his supporters to say, oh, no, we inherited this horrible economy. Inflation was under 2% when Biden came in. You're talking 8, 9%. It went down a little bit from last quarter, but it's still sky high, which if you fill up, a tank of gas, if you try and buy groceries, someday if you want to buy a house or be in an apartment, those costs are increasingly out of reach for a lot of Americans out there. We got to stop spending money. We've got to put more power in the hands of employers, particularly small business owners, and in turn, that empowers us to do these other things along the way. So, a great question.
Thank you very much.
Sure.
This concludes Q&A.
One last thing, and then we'll wrap up and you'll get on to your next session, and it's great seeing you here. So thanks for any of you who are new. We're glad to have you at one of our programs. For those of you who have been at other programs, we're glad to have you back. Not only keep coming back, but keep telling fellow students. I want to tell you one quick story. Dr. Folson and I were chatting about this earlier. He's a superstar. You're going to be excited with his presentation as well. But one reminder, particularly as high schoolers, of not only being here, and I hope one of the things I often hear at these conferences is students say, not only did I like the speakers, but it was great to see that there were other students, there are other people your age who have some of the same thoughts and beliefs that you do. Because I got to believe that's pretty intimidating. Even though it seems like, oh, I'm older, and I am, and my kids are already grown, they're in their 20s, I oftentimes feel a sense of connection with all of you, because when I was governor, they sent about 100,000 protesters to take over my capital. And the reason they did that was to try and intimidate us from doing what was right. Now, we didn't back down. You heard in the introduction, we even had a recall. We were the first one to ever defeat a recall election because our ideas actually worked. And so, one, I would encourage you with that. The other thing I want to tell you, just to leave you with, is an interesting story Dr. Folsom and I were talking about. So I mentioned Ronald Reagan was an actor, but he was a B actor, which meant his movies were kind of the movie that would come on before the main attraction. Again, kind of like what we'd experience today, an opening act at a concert. So a decent band, but not the one you're coming to see. And he did all these different movies over the years. But one of the movies he did was called The Code of the Secret Service. I believe, if I remember right, I think it was in 1939. Well, as a reminder about not only at this conference, but as you finish off your time in high school, as you go on to whatever's next in life, whether it's college, a community college, an apprenticeship, workforce, whatever it is, be mindful of the people that you associate with and the impact it has on your life, your parents, your family, your friends, your work, your coworkers, and others. Because you never know what kind of an impact it'll have not only on you, but on others throughout the rest of your life. So there's this movie that Ronald Reagan didn't care for much. I think it was his least favorite movie to do. It was called The Code of the Secret Service. Well, there was a young kid at the time named Jerry Parr who saw that movie in 1939. And years later, that movie actually inspired him to be a part of the U.S. Secret Service. What makes it interesting is in the spring of 1981, he was the Secret Service agent in charge that day. And that was the day that, walking out of the Washington Hilton, John Hinckley pulled out a gun and shot and hit President Reagan, as well as others in his security detail and his press secretary at the time. And that agent, who was in charge that day, had to make a split-second decision. The protocol was to take the president back to the White House. But in that split second, Jerry Parr made a decision, because of where they were at in Washington, to divert the motorcade to George Washington University Hospital. Why that's significant is, after this all was done, some of the folks at the hospital, the doctors said that had he not done that, the president likely would have bled out and died. Now, that's traumatic enough, but even more so because for those of us who were alive back then, it would be almost like a curse, because there was these timelines of Kennedy, Reagan. If you look back in time, it was similar to this pattern. So there was already this bad omen out there. So he was just moments, literally minutes away from having bled out, had not been for that decision for Jerry Parr to divert the motorcade to that hospital at that time in that moment. Why I say that has an impact is, one, it's a motivational story about just him doing that. But Jerry Parr was inspired to go into the Secret Service because of a movie called The Code of the Secret Service. And you know who the star of that movie was? Ronald Reagan. Why I tell you that is, you don't have any idea about things you're doing right now and people that are influencing you that might come back later and not only influence your life, but change the course of history for the rest of this world. So choose wisely. The fact that you're here suggests that you're making those kinds of wise decisions. But think about that not only when you're here, when you're at school, but with the things that you choose to do and the people you choose to associate with for years to come. I'm confident you're going to make a life-changing decision that's going to be good for all of us as well. So thanks for being here.